My name's Chris Cook, and today I'll be discussing a basic definition of sociology, which is in fact maybe a little bit more complex and subjective than it might seem at face value. And then we'll be looking at one of the key concepts in sociology, which is referred to as the sociological imagination. So first off, sociology is probably best described as the scientific study of social patterns. Essentially, sociologists are engaged in applying empirical frameworks and analyses to society, and particularly focusing on the connection between social structure and the individual. Now, social patterns are really where sociologists find most of their work. And when I say work, I mean they are able to refine research questions and explore social phenomenon when in fact we see some sort of pattern in terms of outcomes. Now I want to give you an example of that. So we're looking at a couple of social conditions, the next bullet point here, wealth and poverty. Wealth and poverty. Now, in fact, wealth being a kind of the state of having resources or an abundance of resources, and poverty referring to a state of lacking resources, financial resources primarily. Of course, poverty is technically defined as having an income below federal poverty guidelines, which, just to give you an idea, for 2017 was about $11,500 for an individual and about $24,500 annually for a family of four. So having a low income is what we're talking about here. Now, of course, wealth and poverty are not randomly distributed social conditions, meaning that those conditions, or the likelihood of having wealth or not having wealth, are correlated with, of course, aspects of our social background, which is a key term. You'll notice that in many of our lectures, the key terms are highlighted in different colored text. For this lecture, the text is red. In other lectures, the text might be another color. But of course, the likelihood of having a lot of financial resources or not having many financial resources, depends to a large degree upon the individual, and of course has to do with things like agency and motivation and intelligence. But of course, also those conditions correlate with factors of our identity, such as our race, the color of our skin, of course our social class, which is often determined by financial resources, but not always, our physical sex, gender and gender identity, ability status, sexual orientation, religion, education, meaning the level of education that one acquires, and of course the quality of education and where an individual receives their education from can all be determining factors in whether or not an individual has wealth or an abundance of resources or lacks resources and potentially exists in poverty. Now, not only are wealth and poverty correlated with social background, which once again are aspects of our identity as individuals, but also with social environment. Now, social environment refers to the kind of broader social and historical context within which we exist, and also has to do with the way that social institutions, the primary building blocks of society, like politics, the economy, religion, education, just to name a few, are organized. So we'll be kind of expanding on these items, but just to recap, we're looking at these two conditions, an abundance of resources being wealth and the lack of resources being poverty, and how they relate to social background and social environment. So let's go ahead and take a look at a bit of data to kind of contextualize our analysis here. Now, what we're looking at here is data on wealth. This is median household wealth in the United States in 2016 by race. Now, first off, I should say something about the data point itself. Median household wealth. Median household wealth is a data point that refers to the median level of total financial resources that a household holds in the United States. So of course households vary based on size. You could have a single parent household, you could have dual earners, you could have even more than two earners in a single household. So this says nothing about the size of households. And it's also the median amount of wealth. So medians are quite good because they, or at least for sociological analysis, because they control for outliers. So of course, this median data is including, people like, say, Jeff Bezos with tens of billions of dollars in his financial portfolio, or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, or any of these multi-billionaires who top the Forbes wealthiest citizens list every year. But those data points are not, in fact, a huge influence on the median. So, of course, the median refers to the data point that's smack dab in the middle of the distribution. And so what we're seeing here is household wealth by racial category. These are the racial categories that are defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. So, we're using the data that we have. These are, of course, imperfect categories, and we'll talk about things like the social construction of race a bit later in class, but this is the data that we have, and so this is the data that we'll be using. So what we're seeing here is essentially huge disparities in household wealth. First off, I'll draw your attention to the all households bar. Of course, the median level of wealth for all households in the United States was $97,300 in 2016. But if we go back to white families, white non-Hispanic, as defined by the Census Bureau, we see that the median household wealth is $171,000 US dollars. For those who identify as other or multiple race, we see $64,800. For those who identify as Hispanic or Latino, we have a number that is $20,700, and for Black or African American, non-Hispanic Americans, or those who identify as such, we see a median household wealth of $17,600. So you're seeing, this kind of gap, significant gap in household wealth in relation to race. Next, we're taking a look at poverty data. This is from the last full census that was conducted in 2010. In fact, poverty rates have declined just a little bit. Last time I checked, in the 2018 data, our poverty rate for all races in the U.S. was between 13 and 14%. So we have seen a decline, a reduction in poverty, but the trends generally hold true. So this data from 2010 is a good proxy for disparities in poverty today, by race, I mean. So we do see the poverty rate for all races, as I mentioned previously, is 15.1%. For whites, you see a poverty rate of 13%. For white non-Hispanic, you see a poverty rate of 9.9%. For African Americans or Black Americans, the poverty rates grow significantly to 27.4%. Asian Americans at 12.1%, and Hispanic of any race. So that's including people who who identify as multiple race, but also include Hispanic in their demographic indicator at 26.6%. So essentially what we're seeing here, if we compare, say, the poverty rate for African Americans with white non-Hispanics, is is a huge disparity. So African Americans are about 3 times more likely, almost 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to be in poverty. Now, it is important to keep in mind that although white non-Hispanic Americans do show the lowest poverty rate here, as a group, most poor people in the United States are in fact white. And now that is in fact a function of population size. So white Americans in the 2010 census accounted for about 64% of the US population. And so by extension, a 9.9% poverty rate, results in a very large population of impoverished Americans who identify as white non-Hispanic. So, this data is showing us poverty rates within racial groups. So among white non-Hispanics, the poverty rate is 9.9%. Among African Americans, the poverty rate is 27.4%. So we're seeing once again this kind of trend showing economic disparities between racial groups in the United States. So the next thing that we want to do is answer the question, what causes these disparities in wealth and poverty between racial groups? Is this just a kind of natural process? Is this somehow resultant from individualistic factors, or does it have to do with society and social structure? And to answer this question, C. Wright Mills' concept of the sociological imagination, which is, I think, undoubtedly one of the most important contributions to sociological thinking in the 20th century, and is a concept that is studied in most introductory sociology courses today. So the sociological imagination was a concept that was included in a book of the same title that was published in 1959 and written by C. Wright Mills. And you're going to be reading more about Mills this week, so I won't say a tremendous amount, but I do want to just introduce you to the topic. Mills develops this idea of the sociological imagination, which is essentially a way to understand the troubles, the problems that we have in our own lives by using a structural lens. So, let's kind of engage in a little exercise here to show the difference between applying a sociological imagination and not applying a sociological imagination. So Mills says that most of us, now he is American and he's focusing on Americans, but I would argue that this applies globally to different degrees dependent upon social context and environment, are socialized into individualistic thinking. To put it simply, we're taught to credit individuals, including ourselves, for our successes, or attach success to agency, which means our kind of abilities, and also to do the same with failures. So in more simplistic terms, our successes are our own. We view our successes and the successes of others as the result of hard work, ambition, maybe a little bit of luck, but primarily having to do with an individual's abilities. And we also view failures through the same lens. So if an individual gets a bad grade or loses their job, we tend to look at potential flaws in that person as a way to explain, right, that failure or that lack of success. So for applying what Mills calls a private troubles perspective, which is essentially an individualistic explanation for a social condition, then if we're looking at the racial wealth gap, we might kind of defer to biological explanations. There are just fundamental differences between, say, Black Americans, Latino Americans, white Americans, Asian Americans that can account for these differential levels of wealth and differential levels of poverty. Now, I think that there's a tremendous amount of research that has debunked these explanations, and the most current genetic research is showing us that there really is no genetic difference between people based on the color of their skin, or the genetic differences are so minor that they would be, it would be impossible for them to account for disparities in social conditions. But nevertheless, these explanations exist, and they primarily fall in the individualistic camp. Now, on the other hand, we might refer to cultural explanations. Now, these are often in what we call stereotypes. So we might use racial stereotypes or cultural stereotypes about groups of people to explain their social position, or to explain a specific social condition such as poverty or wealth. In more simplistic terms, this argument might be that some people just work harder or are smarter or are more motivated because of their culture, right? Because of their kind of group norms and these types of things. Now, as you can imagine, the individual explanations don't have a tremendous amount of explanatory power. If you're having a critical discussion, questions may come up that challenge individualistic interpretations, right? Especially when we start to consider some of the aspects of social structure and the historical context, particularly, that might account for racial disparities in levels of wealth or rates of poverty. So if we're using what C. Wright Mills calls a public issue perspective, which is a structural explanation for a social condition. So instead of looking at the individual and attaching their success or failure to individual agency, their own kind of abilities, we look at the social structure. Then we might be able to realize a bit more explanatory power with our analysis. Now, it is important to keep in mind here that C. Wright Mills was not advocating for a kind of total reliance upon structural explanation. C. Wright Mills argues that we need to combine both the private troubles and the public issues perspectives in order to gain a greater understanding of our own social position, but also the social position of others, right? So the sociological imagination is a powerful tool, actually, for cultivating empathy. It's a powerful tool for understanding and relating to people from maybe social backgrounds that are different from our own. So if we're looking at the racial wealth gap as a public issue, then probably one of the most glaring kind of obvious factors is the level of institutional discrimination that exists in American society today. So institutional discrimination refers to unfair practices that result in unequal treatment of individuals or groups of individuals based on arbitrary factors like skin color. Now, institutional discrimination has a long history in the United States. Of course, one of the most glaring examples of institutional discrimination would be the slave system that the United States relied upon for over several centuries, and which resulted in the enslavement of up to 4 million African Americans, or those who were labeled as African American and therefore placed in slavery. Now, of course, discrimination didn't end with slavery. After slavery, we see processes like redlining and restrictive covenants that result in housing discrimination, that result in ultimately residential segregation, and that have created a kind of segregated landscape in many of our cities here in the United States that persists today. We also can look at lending discrimination. So Ladd, in his 1998 piece, detailed the way that many mortgage lenders were discriminating either overtly or implicitly against minority home buyers. Essentially, these folks were getting higher interest rates than their white counterparts. They were being shown homes in neighborhoods that had high levels of racial segregation, and essentially they were paying more for financial services related to housing than their white counterparts. Additionally, Deva Pager, in her seminal piece, The Mark of a Criminal Record, which we'll talk about in more detail in our unit on deviance and crime, showed that many hiring managers are implicitly biased towards white candidates. The main finding in her piece was that white job applicants who admitted to a felony drug trafficking conviction and having served time in a federal penitentiary were more likely to be called back for a job interview than black applicants with no criminal record. So not only did pagers show the bias against those with a criminal record or who have been labeled criminal, but also the implicit bias that exists in many social institutions against African Americans and other racial minorities. We can also look at disproportionate rates of incarceration. The oft-cited statistic is that African Americans and Latino Americans account for over half the prison population, but only close to 30% of the total U.S. population, which is, of course, a glaring example of overrepresentation. So what we did here was look at the racial wealth gap through a structural lens. We essentially took into account aspects of social context and historical context in order to understand the disparity in wealth and poverty that we see today. So just to distill this a bit further, when groups are excluded from building wealth because they're subjected to slavery, when they're excluded from gaining education because they're subjected to slavery, when they're excluded from purchasing homes in desirable neighborhoods because of redlining, which is a term that refers to the denial of financial services to people of color, or they're overtly restricted from desirable neighborhoods through restrictive covenants, like many neighborhoods in Seattle had up until the mid-1940s. Or when they're discriminated against, when they apply for a home loan or apply for a job, when they might face racial profiling or disproportionate rates of use of force and experience incarceration at higher rates. That group is going to be much less likely to have high proportions of its population in upper socioeconomic status positions and is likely to face high levels of poverty. So I think C. Wright Mills' concept of the sociological imagination has much more kind of explanatory power than does an individualistic explanation, particularly when looking at racial wealth gaps.